My daughter said I was too emotional, too dramatic, and too sensitive for my own good. So she dismissed every feeling I shared, rolled her eyes at my tears, and treated my heart like it was made of cheap glass that broke too easily. But I wasn't fragile. I wasn't overreacting. While she thought my sensitivity was a weakness she could ignore, I was planning to show her that some pain cuts so deep it changes you forever. And the most devastating wounds are the ones inflicted by people who claim they love you but refuse to see you bleed. I raised Jessica with tenderness in a world that taught women to be tough. After her father left when she was 8, I made sure she never doubted she was loved, never questioned whether her feelings mattered, never had to wonder if someone would be there to catch her when she fell. I was the mother who listened to every playground drama like it was a Supreme Court case, who validated her teenage heartbreaks with the same seriousness I'd give to national tragedies, who taught her that emotions weren't weakness but the very essence of what made us human. When Jessica cried because a friend excluded her from a birthday party, I held her until the tears stopped and then helped her understand that some people don't know how to be kind. When she sobbed over her first breakup at 16, I sat with her all night, bringing tissues and ice cream and reassurance that love would find her again. When she worried about college applications, afraid she wasn't smart enough or good enough, I reminded her daily that she was extraordinary exactly as she was. I worked 2 jobs to pay for her psychology degree, believing that someone who understood human emotion as deeply as Jessica did would help heal a broken world. I was so proud when she graduated summa cum laude, when she landed a position at a prestigious therapy practice, when she bought her own house in the suburbs. My sensitive, empathetic daughter was going to spend her life helping other sensitive souls navigate their pain. It felt like cosmic justice, like all the gentleness I'd poured into her would multiply and spread to everyone she touched. But somewhere between graduate school and professional success, Jessica developed armor that protected her from other people's pain, including mine. She started talking about emotional boundaries and codependency like they were diseases she needed to avoid. When I'd call her after a difficult day, needing the same comfort I'd always provided her, she'd say, "Mom, you're being too intense. You need to learn to regulate your emotions better." The woman who'd been raised on unconditional emotional support had decided that feelings were problems to be managed rather than experiences to be honored. The first betrayal came after my best friend Margaret died suddenly of a stroke. I'd known Margaret for 30 years. We'd raised our children together, supported each other through divorces and financial struggles, shared countless cups of coffee and even more tears. When she died, I felt like half my heart had been ripped away. I called Jessica, sobbing, needing my daughter to understand that I'd lost not just a friend but a sister of the soul. Instead of comfort, I got a therapy session. "Mom, you're catastrophizing this loss. Death is a natural part of life and you're allowing your grief to become overwhelming. You need to focus on acceptance and moving forward rather than dwelling in this emotional spiral." She spoke to me like I was one of her patients, clinical and detached, offering therapeutic platitudes instead of the maternal comfort I desperately needed. The second betrayal happened during my 68th birthday dinner. I'd been feeling invisible lately, like the world was moving past me while I stood still, and I tried to share these feelings with Jessica over our meal. "Sometimes I feel like I don't matter anymore," I said quietly, "like I've become irrelevant to everyone's life, even my own daughter's." Instead of reassurance, Jessica sighed audibly and put down her fork. "Mom, this victim mentality isn't healthy. You're creating drama where none exists. I'm here, aren't I? We're having dinner. But you're so focused on perceived slights and imaginary problems that you can't just enjoy the moment." The dismissal stung worse than the loneliness I'd been trying to describe. My daughter had reduced my deepest fears to victim mentality and perceived slights, like my emotional reality was just a psychological disorder that needed correcting. The third betrayal cut the deepest because it involved my health anxiety. I'd been having strange symptoms, dizziness, fatigue, memory lapses that scared me because my mother had developed dementia at 70. When I tried to talk to Jessica about my fears, She immediately shifted into professional mode. Mom, health anxiety is very common in older adults. You're experiencing normal age-related changes and catastrophizing them into serious illness. You need to stop Googling symptoms and see your regular doctor for routine checkups instead of spiraling into worst-case scenarios. She didn't ask about the specific symptoms. She didn't offer to come with me to doctor's appointments. She didn't acknowledge that watching my mother disappear piece by piece into dementia might give me legitimate reasons to worry about similar symptoms. She just diagnosed me with anxiety and prescribed emotional detachment like it was medication. The daughter I'd raised to be compassionate had become someone who treated my fears like character flaws rather than human experiences deserving of empathy. The breaking point came 6 months later when I was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. The doctor delivered the news with gentle professionalism, explaining the progression, the treatment options, the lifestyle changes that might slow the decline. I sat in that office chair feeling like my world was crumbling, knowing that my worst fears had been validated, that the symptoms Jessica had dismissed as anxiety were actually my brain beginning its slow retreat from clarity. I called Jessica immediately after the appointment, tears streaming down my face, needing my daughter more than I'd ever needed anyone. Jessica, honey, I need you. The doctor confirmed it's Alzheimer's. I'm so scared. Can you please come over? I don't want to be alone right now. My voice was breaking with every word, raw with the kind of terror that comes from facing your mortality while feeling completely alone. Her response shattered something in me that I didn't even know could break. Mom, you need to calm down. Getting hysterical isn't going to change the diagnosis. Alzheimer's is manageable in the early stages, and you're catastrophizing the situation. I can't drop everything every time you have an emotional crisis. You need to learn coping strategies for dealing with difficult news. I sat there holding the phone, staring at the medical pamphlets about memory care and advanced directives, listening to my daughter tell me that receiving a terminal diagnosis was just another emotional crisis I needed to manage better. The woman I'd comforted through every scraped knee, broken heart, and disappointed dream was telling me to calm down about losing my mind piece by piece. Jessica, this isn't an emotional crisis. This is me telling you I have a disease that's going to steal everything I am, and I'm terrified. I need my daughter to care enough to sit with me while I fall apart. My voice was steady now, cold with the realization that I was truly alone in this fight. Mom, I do care, but I can't enable your tendency to dramatize everything. You've always been overly emotional, and now you're using this diagnosis as an excuse to be even more dramatic. I'll call you later when you've had time to process this rationally. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me sitting in my kitchen with Alzheimer's pamphlets and the crushing understanding that my own daughter saw my terror as theatrical performance. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and made a decision that would change both our lives forever. If Jessica thought I was too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic, then I would show her what real pain looked like. I would teach her that sensitivity isn't a character flaw. It's what allows us to connect with other human beings. And when that sensitivity is stripped away, when someone becomes numb to other people's pain, they lose something essential that can never be fully recovered. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Patricia Henley, who'd helped me with various legal matters over the years. Patricia, I need to update some documents in light of my recent diagnosis, I said calmly. I've learned some things about my daughter that require me to reconsider our arrangements. Patricia had known Jessica since she was a child, had watched her grow up and succeed, but she was professional enough not to ask prying questions about family dynamics. I spent the afternoon reviewing my will, my power of attorney documents, my healthcare directives. Jessica was listed as the primary beneficiary and decision-maker for everything. Our arrangement I'd made years ago, assuming she'd handle my affairs with the same loving care I'd always shown her. But love required empathy, and Jessica had systematically trained herself out of feeling other people's pain. I couldn't trust someone who saw my emotions as inconveniences to honor my wishes when I could no longer advocate for myself. Over the next few weeks, I began documenting our interactions with the methodical precision of someone who understands they're building a case. Every phone call where Jessica dismissed my feelings. Every visit where she treated my concerns as symptoms to be managed rather than experiences to be witnessed. Every time she used her psychology training to pathologize my normal human responses to loss, fear, and uncertainty. I also started reaching out to other people in my life, people who still remembered how to respond to pain with compassion rather than clinical detachment. My neighbor Carol, who brought me soup when I wasn't feeling well. My church friend Robert, who called weekly to check on me after Margaret's death. My cousin Linda in Arizona, who'd been sending cards and calling more frequently since she learned about my diagnosis. These people understood that facing Alzheimer's was genuinely terrifying, that needing comfort wasn't weakness, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is simply witness someone's pain without trying to fix or minimize it. I began building relationships with Jessica's professional contacts, not to spy on her but to understand how she presented herself in her work life versus how she treated her own mother. I made appointments with other therapists in her practice, ostensibly for support in dealing with my diagnosis, but really to observe how trained professionals should respond to someone facing cognitive decline. The contrast was stark and damning. I started with small changes that Jessica wouldn't notice immediately. When she called with her weekly check-ins, I began responding with the same emotional flatness she'd been showing me for years. When she asked how I was feeling, I'd say, "Fine," instead of sharing my actual experiences. When she offered advice about managing my diagnosis, I'd respond with, "I'll consider that," instead of engaging in conversation. I was giving her exactly the emotional distance she'd been demanding, and watching to see if she'd notice the difference. The first real test came when I missed our regular Sunday dinner without calling to cancel. For 3 years, we'd had standing plans every Sunday, a tradition I'd maintained even when Jessica's responses to my conversational attempts became increasingly clinical. When she called that evening, confused about why I hadn't shown up, I explained calmly that I'd decided to have dinner with Carol instead. "Mom, why didn't you call me? I was worried something had happened." Her voice carried the first hint of genuine emotion I'd heard in months, concern mixed with confusion about the disruption to our routine. "I didn't think you'd mind," I said evenly. "You've been telling me I'm too emotional about our relationship, so I thought you'd prefer less drama in your schedule." The silence that followed told me she was beginning to understand that her emotional dismissals had consequences. The second test came when I stopped calling her with updates about my medical appointments. For months, I'd been sharing every doctor's visit, every new symptom, every concern about my progression, only to have each conversation turn into a therapy session about managing my catastrophic thinking. When 2 weeks passed without medical updates, Jessica called to ask about my recent neurology appointment. "How did it go with Dr. Martinez last week?" she asked. "It went fine," I replied, offering no details about the medication adjustments, the cognitive tests, the conversations about long-term care planning. When Jessica pressed for more information, I said, "I'm following your advice about not dramatizing my medical situation. I'm handling it rationally without burdening you with emotional reactions." Again, the silence stretched uncomfortably as she processed this change in our dynamic. Meanwhile, I was building deeper connections with people who actually cared about my emotional well-being. Carol and I started having weekly coffee dates where we talked about everything. My fears about losing my memories, my sadness about Jessica's emotional withdrawal, my gratitude for the good moments I was still experiencing. These conversations reminded me what it felt like to be heard without judgment, to have feelings validated rather than pathologized. I joined a support group for people with early-stage Alzheimer's, something Jessica had suggested months ago in her clinical way. But instead of attending because my daughter recommended it, I went because I wanted to connect with people who understood my experience. The group included retired teachers, former business owners, grandmothers and grandfathers who were facing the same terrifying future I was. None of them treated my fears as character flaws or my sadness as symptoms to be managed. The most powerful part of my plan involved redirecting my legal and financial arrangements. Patricia helped me establish a trust that would fund Alzheimer's research and support services, causes that Jessica should have cared about given my diagnosis but had never mentioned. I changed my healthcare proxy from Jessica to Linda, my cousin who lived across the country but called weekly and remembered every detail of my medical updates. The will changes were the most significant. Instead of leaving everything to Jessica, I divided my estate between several beneficiaries. Carol would get my house because she'd shown me more neighborly love than my daughter had shown maternal concern. The support group would receive funds to continue their programs. Linda's grandchildren, who sent me drawings and letters, would have college funds. Jessica would receive a small inheritance with a letter explaining exactly why she'd been excluded from the larger bequests. 6 months after my diagnosis, Jessica called with unusual excitement in her voice. "Mom, I have incredible news. I've been offered a position as the director of a new therapy center specializing in family counseling. It's a huge opportunity and I wanted to share it with you first." She was practically glowing over the phone, clearly expecting me to respond with the maternal pride and enthusiasm I'd always shown for her accomplishments. Instead, I felt nothing but cold irony. Here was my daughter, excited about helping other families improve their emotional connections, while she'd spent years systematically destroying her relationship with her own mother. "That's nice, Jessica," I said flatly. "I'm sure you'll do well." The lack of enthusiasm in my voice must have been jarring because she paused, confused. "Mom, I thought you'd be more excited. This is exactly the kind of work I've always dreamed of doing, helping families communicate better, teaching people to understand each other's emotional needs." The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but I didn't point it out directly. Instead, I simply said, "I hope you're better at understanding your client's emotions than you've been at understanding mine." The silence stretched uncomfortably before Jessica tried to laugh it off. "Mom, you're being dramatic again. Of course I understand your emotions. I'm a trained therapist." "Are you?" I asked quietly, because a trained therapist would recognize that someone facing Alzheimer's might have legitimate fears that deserve compassion rather than clinical dismissal. A trained therapist would understand that calling someone's terror about losing their mind dramatization is cruel rather than helpful. "Mom, I think you're misunderstanding my professional approach. I've been trying to help you develop healthy coping mechanisms instead of enabling unhealthy emotional patterns." She was falling back into her clinical language, proving my point about her inability to separate professional detachment from personal relationship. "Jessica, let me ask you something. If one of your clients came to you and said their adult child dismissed their Alzheimer's diagnosis as catastrophizing and refused to provide emotional support during their darkest moments, what would you tell that client?" The question hung in the air, and I could almost hear her struggling to answer without condemning her own behavior. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Jessica clearly disturbed by my emotional distance but unable to identify why our dynamic felt so different. Over the next few weeks, she began calling more frequently, probably sensing that something had fundamentally changed between us but not understanding what or why. The first real crack in her composure came when she learned about my support group involvement. "Mom, Mrs. Patterson from church mentioned seeing you at some kind of group meeting. What's that about?" Her tone carried curiosity mixed with something that might have been concern, the first genuine emotion I'd heard from her in months. "It's a support group for people with early-stage Alzheimer's," I explained matter-of-factly. "We meet weekly to discuss our experiences and feelings about the diagnosis. It's very helpful to talk with people who understand what we're going through." I didn't mention that the group had become my primary source of emotional support, the place where my fears were validated rather than pathologized. "Why didn't you tell me you were doing that? I could have helped you find appropriate resources." Her voice carried hurt now, confusion about being excluded from a significant part of my coping process. "You did help me find resources," I said evenly. You told me to stop dramatizing my situation and develop better coping strategies. This is me following your advice. The second crack came when Jessica learned about my new relationship with Carol. She'd stopped by unexpectedly one afternoon and found Carol and me cooking together, laughing over stories about our grandchildren, sharing the kind of comfortable intimacy that comes from mutual care and understanding. When Carol left, Jessica confronted me about the obviously close friendship. "Mom, you seem really attached to Mrs. Richardson. Are you replacing me with her?" The vulnerability in her voice was startling, a glimpse of the little girl who used to worry about being abandoned after her father left. But the woman who dismissed my vulnerabilities for years didn't deserve immediate comfort for her own insecurities. "I'm not replacing anyone, Jessica. I'm simply investing my emotional energy in people who value it rather than treating it like a burden." My words were chosen carefully, designed to help her understand the connection between her emotional dismissals and my emotional withdrawal. "Mom, I don't treat your emotions like a burden. I'm trying to help you process difficult feelings in healthy ways." She was still clinging to her professional justifications, still unable to recognize that therapeutic techniques weren't appropriate for maternal relationships. "Jessica, when I told you I was terrified about my Alzheimer's diagnosis, you told me I was being dramatic and catastrophizing. When I needed comfort, you offered clinical advice. When I needed my daughter, you gave me a therapist. That's not help. That's abandonment dressed up in professional language." The words finally seemed to penetrate her defenses because she went very quiet. The most devastating revelation came when Jessica learned about the changes to my legal documents. Patricia had advised informing her directly rather than letting her discover the changes after my death, both for legal protection and because the shock might serve as a wake-up call about our deteriorating relationship. I invited Jessica for coffee on a Saturday morning, the first time I'd initiated contact with her in months. She arrived hopeful, probably thinking this represented progress in our relationship. Instead, I handed her copies of my updated will, power of attorney documents, and healthcare directives, along with a letter explaining my reasons for the changes. As she read, her face went through a progression of emotions I hadn't seen in years. Confusion, disbelief, hurt, anger, and finally something that might have been genuine pain. "Mom, you can't be serious. You're leaving everything to virtual strangers? You've made Linda your healthcare proxy instead of me? I'm your daughter. I'm trained to handle these kinds of decisions." "You are my daughter," I agreed quietly. "But being someone's child doesn't automatically qualify you to make decisions about their care, especially when you've demonstrated that you see their emotional needs as inconveniences rather than valid human experiences." I kept my voice gentle but firm, explaining rather than attacking. "This is because I've tried to help you manage your emotions better, because I've used my professional training to give you tools for coping with difficult situations." She was still framing her emotional dismissals as helpful interventions, still unable to recognize the damage she'd caused. "Jessica, this is because you've forgotten how to love someone without trying to fix them. You've trained yourself to see emotion as pathology rather than humanity. You've become so afraid of other people's pain that you've lost the ability to sit with someone who's suffering and simply witness their experience with compassion." The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Jessica cycling through various stages of grief and denial. She tried to argue that her approach had been professionally appropriate, that she'd been protecting herself from codependency, that I was punishing her for maintaining healthy boundaries. But each justification only proved my point about her inability to distinguish between professional relationships and family love. "Mom, I can learn to be more emotionally available. I can change how I respond to you. Please don't do this. Don't cut me out of your life because I made mistakes." Her voice was breaking now, filled with the kind of raw emotion she'd been teaching me to suppress for years. "I'm not cutting you out of my life, Jessica. But I am protecting myself from further emotional harm. I have a progressive disease that's going to steal my memories, my personality, my ability to advocate for myself. I can't trust those decisions to someone who sees my feelings as problems to be solved rather than experiences to be honored. The weeks that followed were difficult for both of us. Jessica called repeatedly, leaving voicemails that ranged from professional to pleading to angry. She tried to use her therapeutic training to analyze my decision, then switched to emotional appeals about our shared history, then finally resorted to accusations about my mental competency being affected by the Alzheimer's. Each voicemail proved my point about her inability to respond to emotional situations with appropriate empathy. Even faced with the loss of her inheritance and her role as my decision-maker, she couldn't simply acknowledge my pain and commit to treating me with more compassion. Instead, she pathologized my response, questioned my mental state, and focused on what she was losing rather than what she'd failed to provide. The final test came when I was hospitalized briefly for pneumonia, a common complication for Alzheimer's patients. I didn't call Jessica directly. Instead, I had Carol notify her as a courtesy. Jessica rushed to the hospital, probably expecting to resume her role as my primary support person and medical advocate. But when she arrived, she found Carol holding my hand, Linda participating in medical discussions via video call, and a team of healthcare providers who'd been briefed on my preferences for communication and decision-making. Jessica was welcome to visit, but she was no longer central to my care team. "Mom, this is crazy. I'm your daughter. I should be the one coordinating your care, making sure you get appropriate treatment." She was frustrated by her peripheral role, confused by the efficient support system that had formed around me in her absence. "You are my daughter," I said weakly from my hospital bed, "but you're not my advocate. Advocates care about their clients' emotional well-being, not just their clinical outcomes. They listen to fears without dismissing them as symptoms. They provide comfort without conditions." Even in my weakened state, I was clear about the distinction. Jessica spent an hour in my hospital room, watching Carol anticipate my needs, Linda coordinate with doctors about my care preferences, and various friends from my support group stopped by with flowers and genuine concern. She was witnessing the support network I'd built to replace the emotional connection she'd systematically destroyed. When the doctor explained my treatment plan, Jessica tried to interject with questions and suggestions, falling back into the take-charge role she'd always assumed was hers by right. But the medical team looked to Linda for approval, consulted with Carol about my comfort preferences, and treated Jessica like any other visitor rather than the primary decision-maker. "This isn't right," Jessica said quietly as we watched Carol help me with dinner while Linda coordinated my discharge planning over video. "I should be the one taking care of you. I'm your family." The pain in her voice was genuine, probably the first unguarded emotion she'd shown me in years. "Family is about more than blood, Jessica. It's about showing up consistently, caring about someone's emotional well-being, treating their fears and joys as important simply because they matter to that person. You taught yourself out of those responses because you thought they were unprofessional weaknesses. These people never forgot that caring about someone means caring about their whole emotional experience, not just managing their symptoms." 3 years have passed since that conversation in the hospital, and my Alzheimer's has progressed to the point where I have good days and difficult days, moments of clarity mixed with periods of confusion. But through it all, I've been surrounded by people who understand that disease doesn't diminish dignity, that losing memories doesn't mean losing the right to emotional respect, that caring for someone with cognitive decline requires heart as much as medical knowledge. Carol has become my primary caregiver, moving into my house to provide daily support while allowing me to remain in familiar surroundings for as long as possible. She responds to my repetitive questions with patience, comforts me during moments of confusion with gentle reassurance, and treats each day we have together as a gift rather than a burden. This is what love looks like when it's not filtered through clinical detachment. Linda coordinates my care from Arizona with the dedication of a daughter, calling weekly to check on my medical needs, remembering every doctor's appointment, sending cards that brighten my difficult days. Her grandchildren draw me pictures and write letters that Carol reads to me when my reading becomes challenging. They've never met me in person, but they understand that I'm important to their grandmother, which makes me important to them. The support group continues to be a source of comfort and understanding, even as my ability to participate becomes more limited. These people know what it means to lose pieces of yourself gradually, to fear the future while trying to find joy in the present, to need emotional validation rather than clinical management. When I have bad days, they don't tell me I'm catastrophizing. They sit with me in the fear and remind me that I'm not alone. Jessica has tried to reconnect several times, usually during medical crises when she realizes how little control she has over my care decisions. She sends cards on holidays, calls occasionally to check on my status, and maintains what she probably considers appropriate concern for my welfare. But our conversations remain stilted, professional, lacking the warmth that should exist between mother and daughter. The hardest part isn't missing Jessica. It's mourning the relationship I thought we had. I grieve for the daughter I believed I'd raised, someone who would prioritize compassion over clinical correctness, who would understand that loving someone means accepting their emotional reality rather than trying to fix it. That daughter may have existed once, but she disappeared somewhere between graduate school and professional success, replaced by someone who saw feelings as problems to be solved rather than experiences to be witnessed. But I've also discovered something profound in my new life. Vulnerability shared with safe people creates deeper connections than strength maintained in isolation. Carol knows me at my worst, confused, frightened, sometimes angry about what this disease has stolen from me, and she loves me anyway. Linda has never seen me healthy and independent, yet she treats me with the same care she'd show her own mother. The people in my support group understand that needing help isn't weakness but humanity. My memories are fading, but my understanding of love has never been clearer. Love isn't about managing someone's emotions or protecting yourself from their pain. It's about witnessing another person's full human experience, joy and sorrow, fear and hope, strength and vulnerability, and choosing to stay present for all of it. Jessica learned to protect herself from other people's emotions, thinking that made her stronger and more professional. She never learned that the ability to feel deeply, to be affected by other people's pain, is what allows us to truly care for each other. She said I was too sensitive, that my emotions were excessive reactions that needed to be managed and controlled. She was wrong about the first part. Sensitivity isn't a character flaw but a superpower that allows us to connect with other human beings. But she was right about the second part, though not in the way she meant. My emotions did need to be managed, but not by becoming less sensitive. They needed to be managed by sharing them with people who understood their value, who saw feeling deeply as a gift rather than a burden. Some pain never fully heals, but it can transform into wisdom. Jessica thought she could teach me to be less emotional, less dramatic, less sensitive to life's inevitable hurts. Instead, she taught me that sensitivity shared with safe people creates bonds stronger than blood, that emotional authenticity attracts genuine love, and that the capacity to feel deeply, even when it hurts, is what makes us most fully human. The irony is perfect. In trying to make me less sensitive, she made herself numb to the very emotions that might have saved our relationship. Now she gets to live with that numbness while I'm surrounded by people who celebrate sensitivity as the foundation of genuine human connection.